Good evening. I'm Wendy Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Tri-Faith Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us on this fall evening. Man, it's dark out there, right? It's just, I'm not quite used to it yet. But surely we are going to bring a lot of light and warmth into this room and dream about summer and the growing season. So there is a woman who I have become close friends with who I think will listen to this. She wasn't available or maybe even join us in a little bit. Her name is Chandler, and she is a strengths-based coach. She used to, she still does do quite a bit with that. And she sent me a note that said she really felt that this initiative was a strengths-based strategy for Tri-Faith between my personal love for the garden and tending the earth and the Tri-Faith initiative and the relationships that are built. And so while I am here to merely moderate, I want you to know that tonight is surely going to fill my bucket. And I'm so grateful, Fred, that you are here to join us. We are so excited to learn from you. And we wanted to begin the evening by sharing a prayer that is part of your book. And I'm going to invite Ilene Arnold to please unmute herself. And I believe for those who have the book, it's on page 20 if you want to follow along.
So this was in chapter 5 where Fred, you're talking with Chris and you're on the way to the airport, and he tells you to read a verse from Ezekiel, and it reminds him of hope for homies. So I'm just kind of giving people a little background as you're flying on your way to Asheville and climbing over the Cascades. You go and read verse 34:27, and this becomes later, you say, a prayer for you. The trees of the field shall yield their fruit, and the earth shall yield its increase. They shall be secure on their soil, and they shall know that I am the Lord, when I break the bars of their yoke and save them from the hands of those who enslave them. They shall no more be plundered for the nations, nor shall the animals of the land devour them. They shall live in safety, and no one shall make them afraid.
Thank you, Ilene. Thank you first to Ilene and Anne for graciously agreeing to join our conversation. They will be helping us to ask questions of Fred after he has had a chance to give us a window into his experience of writing this beautiful book. Fred, I find that people can tell us about themselves better than we could describe them by me telling about your bio. So let's give you the floor. You have rights to the screen share when you're ready, and start by telling us a little bit about you, and then we're looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Ilene, for reading that passage. And good to be with both you and with Anne, and I look forward to our conversation together and with all of the rest of you. So really, really honored to be with all of you tonight here in Zoom land. I wish I could be with you in person, but we're doing the best we can, aren't we? And we're making it work. So a little bit of my story, I grew up here in Southwest Montana, where I'm speaking right now. I just moved back last year with my family, I was telling Wendy, and did not grow up with any love of gardening. In fact, my mom made me use the rototiller in her garden in high school, and I just hated it. I hated that thing. It was smelly and jerked me all around and loud, and maybe that's why I kind of never got into rototillers and started gardening by hand once I took up gardening later in life. But all that's to say, I did not grow up with any knowledge of food, where my food came from, though I did grow up in a very religious home. My parents were medical missionaries in Nigeria in the mid 80s, grew up in the evangelical Christian world, though since moved on later in life to, I would say, a more contemplative kind of Christianity. is what I would consider myself in terms of my spiritual home now. But that's, my journey into this world of food and faith really began when I helped start Anatoth Community Garden and had to learn really quickly how to grow food for several hundred people. And that's a little of the story that I want to open with here is Anatoth Community Garden. And there's Lillian. Hi, Lillian. Good to see you with us. Really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm not going to talk super long. I'm going to keep to my allotted 35 minutes, and then we can all have a great conversation. So let me share my screen. So this is my Twitter handle. This is about my only web presence right now, Twitter. So follow me there if you would like. This is a picture of Anatoth Community Garden. For some reason, it's not letting me change slides.
Use your arrow button to go to the left. There you go.
I'm just
We're on the second slide.
Yep. So this is a picture of me planting with one of my interns at the time, planting some tomatoes. I open it with this quote from Pope Francis because it really gets at the heart, I think, of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Soil, water, mountains, everything is a caress of God. And I love that idea of God caressing us, God loving us through things like soil microbes and mycorrhizal fungi and all of the things that come forth from the earth that feed and nourish us as an expression of God's love. As I said, my story into this book here begins at Anatoth Community Garden, which I helped start in 2005. And this was a garden really intended to build peace and foster racial reconciliation in a very rural part of North Carolina, a very rural conservative part of North Carolina. And we began with this vision from Jeremiah 29 to plant gardens and eat what they produce and to seek the peace of the city to which you've been sent. And we really saw planting gardens and seeking peace as symbiotic activities, like planting pole beans with your corn. The one feeds the other. And here's an aerial view of this garden. It was about an acre in size. And this was kind of in the early years when we started getting going. And the model was kind of like community supported agriculture, where everybody, instead of paying, you come and work. And so you pay $5 to become a member, and you work for several hours a week, and you get an exchange of the produce. And then people get to work together, they get to learn and build relationships, build friendships. And we would grow year round. This was our passive solar high tunnel here where we grew food in the wintertime. Little helper here planting spinach seeds. And you can see the amount of produce that we produced. It was a bio-intensive garden, all dug by hand, relying on compost and organic regenerative agriculture principles. And we really cranked out the food. And this was kind of a typical Saturday where people would come and divide up the harvest that week. But it wasn't just growing food, it was also sharing food at potlucks. And so we had bi-weekly community potlucks. We had bluegrass concerts, and gospel choirs, and we would take the food from the garden down to the church to be blessed. So the garden was connected with the local Methodist church, and the church was kind of the fiscal sponsor for the garden, although they remained separate organizations. And this little Methodist church, we would occasionally have harvest ceremonies down there, or the pastor would come and do a Eucharist out in the garden. And so it was really a kind of big experiment in reconnecting faith with something very tangible, the food and the soil that nourishes all of us. Well, during those 4 years, I was taking notes on conversations and ideas that came up. It was the garden was kind of like a stage, really, in which the full human condition was on display in all its beauty and querulousness, you might say. And the hardest part of directing a community garden, of course, is not the gardening, it's the community. As those of you know, in community, it takes a lot of work to realize the gifts of community. And I knew, as I was part of this big experiment of Anatoth Community Garden, I knew that other people were trying to do similar projects, and that is other faith communities were starting to do this kind of gardening work and farming as an expression of their faith, as a way to reconnect their faith. And I set out to write about that. And that ended up becoming this book, Soil and Sacrament. And I want to be reading just a few very short passages as we go. This is from the intro. The garden is our oldest metaphor. In Genesis, God creates the first Adam from the Adamah and tells him to till and keep it, the fertile soil on which all life depends. Human from humus. That's our first etymological clue as to the inextricable bond we share with the soil. Our ecological problems are a result of having forgotten who we are. Soil people, inspired by the breath of God. Earth's hallowed mold was how John Milton referred to Adam in Paradise Lost, or in St. Augustine's phrase, terra animata, animated earth. So though this is a book about gardening, I really think of it as a book about people, in that it's a book about terra animata, animated earth, and each of us are examples of that animated earth. We're each soil creatures. And as we go down into the earth, as we get more familiar with having our hands in the soil and with growing food, I think we also come to understand who we are as people, and also who we are as people created in the image of God. So I set out to chronicle some of these other communities doing this work, and I ended up visiting 4 different communities. And I'll share a little bit about each one. So you might not think that this is kind of ground zero for the food and faith movement in America, but these guys right here are leading the charge. And this is a group of Trappist monks in Mebkin Abbey, South Carolina. And they're, as part of the Benedictine tradition, the 1500-year-old Benedictine tradition, they are very intimate with the relationship between soil and sacrament, between food and faith. And so this particular group of Trappist monks grows mushrooms. They grow not those kind of mushrooms, but the legal kind, the kind you can eat. So these are oyster mushrooms. They also grow shiitakes, and they sell them to area restaurants. And I really was fascinated with the interplay between growing mushrooms and the life of prayer. And so mushrooms, I came to learn, are but the fruit of the mycelium. And the mycelium is the organism that grows underground, or in this case, in these big columns. And the mycelium is always growing and working underground. And it's connecting things. It's connecting both the living and the dead. It's connecting different tree species and helping them share carbon, for example, in a forest. It does a lot of work ecologically, mycelium. And only every now and then does that mycelium bear fruit. And the fruit, of course, is the mushroom. And so I started thinking about how the prayer of the monks is like the mycelium. It's always working unseen in the darkness. And only on certain occasions do you see the fruits of that prayer. And I reflected on some of those ideas in that chapter. One of the guys I met there, Brother Dismas, was a young guy. And I want to share a piece of wisdom from Brother Dismas here. Brother Dismas was probably 19 when he came to the monastery. And I worked with him out in the mushroom operation one day, sort of packing these columns full of cottonseed hulls and so on. And Brother Dismas said this. He said he came to the monastery because after years of studying academic theology, he realized he couldn't fix a kitchen sink. I needed to put the faith in my hands, he said. He had learned that certain mental and spiritual problems could not be resolved intellectually. They needed to be worked out physically with one's own body. Manual labor was the ancient monastic cure for many a spiritual ailment. I see work as very incarnational, he said. Jesus became flesh, muscle, sinew. He put his body where the question was, and then he walked the question. So in my next community that I visited, let's see if I can get to the next community. I visited each one of these in a different liturgical season. And so I visited the monks in the season of Advent, this time of year, and winter. And then in the spring and Eastertide, I went to this community garden, a Protestant community garden in Western North Carolina called the Lord's Acre. And these folks grow food and give it away to the local food pantry. And they, in so doing, are building community. And they've been going for the past, I guess, 10 or 12 years now. And one of the people that I met there, Susan Sides, is an amazing gardener. She was the gardener for Mother Earth News for a number of years, and probably one of the most talented organic gardeners I've ever met. And she did run the Lord's Acre when I went there. And I really love the way Susan described what they do at the Lord's Acre. She said, "We grow food for the food pantry, but our work here is really about finding ways to make love visible. We begin each day by asking, what does it take for this person, this plant, this community to flourish? And not just individual plants or people, but what does it take for them to flourish in relationship?" And I love that idea of taking a kind of ecological metaphor of relationship, and ecology, of course, is the study of relationships, right? It's a study of how things are connected. Taking that and extending it to not only growing food, but nourishing the people who come to that place. And you can see some of the bounty that came out of the Lord's Acre. In the summer, during the Feast of Pentecost, I went to, appropriately, a Pentecostal farm out in the Skagit Valley of Washington. And this place is called Tierra Nueva, which means new earth. And it's a ministry that combines growing food, but also coffee roasting. And their main goal is working with people who are trying to get out of gangs, people who are in prison, people struggling with addiction, and helping them find new life. And so this is Chris Hoke here on the left. This was the man that Ilene mentioned in the opening prayer when Chris and I were driving to the airport, and he mentioned that verse from Ezekiel. And after writing about Chris and visiting him in his community, we've gone on to become great friends, and he's a fantastic writer himself. He's written a book about his work with people on the margins. It's called Wanted, and it's kind of his spiritual adventure of working with former gang members. For some reason, my screen is not really swiping. There we go. So one of the things that Tierra Nueva does is to partner with Honduran farmers who are growing organic coffee beans, and then they buy those beans at more than fair trade prices. So they give them a really good price for their crop. And they bring them up to the underground coffee project in the Skagit Valley of Washington. And the underground coffee project employs guys who've recently gotten out of prison and are in need of gainful employment and also in need of a community. And so one of the guys, this is Chris Hogue here in the middle, who's the pastor. And on the right is the guy, Zach Joy, that I wrote about in the book. And Zach at the time was the chief coffee roaster there. And Zach was a former addict and crystal meth cook. And he cooked meth and sold it for a while. And when he came to Tierra Nueva, they realized, Zach was trying to turn his life around. They realized this guy's got a set of skills. He knows how to cook things. He knows how to roast. And so they put him to work as their chief coffee roaster. And so it's a wonderful story of him taking those former skills and applying them to better ends as a coffee roaster. And Zach, when I visited him, he was telling me how when each batch of beans comes out and spills into the roasting tray, he lays his hands over them and blesses them. So each batch of beans that goes forth to customers are blessed by Zach's hands, which I thought was really beautiful. So I'm moving quickly here because I want to make sure we have time for conversation, but we can circle back to any things you have questions on. In the fall of that year of traveling around visiting different faith communities engaged in food and agriculture, I visited Adamah Farm at the Isabella Friedman Jewish Life Center in Connecticut. And I went during the Feast of Sukkot, which, as many of you know, is the fall harvest festival. And my knowledge of Judaism when I went was very limited and embarrassingly small. I mean, I have a divinity degree and did not know much about Jewish practices or Jewish culture. And I have to say, I totally fell in love with Adamah Farm and the people there. I really fell in love with every place I went, and have remained in contact with all of the people I've written about. But there was something special here at Adamah that I really was intrigued by, and they sort of emerged as the heroes in my book, as the final chapter, because it was really here at Adamah that I found embodied that kind of vision of soil and sacrament being lived out, where the life of faith and the life of food is deeply integrated. So this farm, Adamah Farm, takes Jewish 20-somethings and brings them in for like 3 months at a time and teaches them to become organic farmers. They live in community. They get up every morning at 6 to daven in the Red Yurt, which is a kind of prayer structure down by the lake. And, this is a beautiful property, beautiful farm. They're farming about 4 acres here. And so I went up there for the Feast of Sukkot and ended up spending about 10 days. And as I was telling Wendy before the talk, Wendy and Ilene and Amy, I felt like I wanted to convert to Judaism when I left. I was just really taken with their prayer and communal meals and the growing of food. And one of the people that I met there at Adamah was a guy named Nigel Savage. And Nigel directs an organization called Hazan, which means vision. And to my knowledge, it's the largest Jewish environmental organization in the US. They have an amazing network of synagogues and shuls connected to different farms through CSA programs. And they really have a robust environmental network that they've built. They're based in New York, but they're really all over the country. And Nigel was telling me that he said he really wanted, when I was interviewing him, he said, I want Jews to be more evangelical about two things. He said he wants Jews to share with the world Shabbat, the need for Shabbat, the need for taking a Sabbath one day a week. And he said, I don't care if you do it on Tuesday or Thursday or Sunday. He said, but everybody should take one day a week and just stop. He said, imagine what it would do for the planet if one day a week we all just stopped. And it's a powerful idea. And the other practice Nigel wants to evangelize, and I'll read you a little section here, is keeping kosher. The literal meaning of kosher is fitting or right. It's the notion of asking, is this fit for me to eat? Is it fitting? The larger context is to ask, what is fitting or right for the earth? What is becoming known to Jews as eco-kashrut? Because if it's fitting or right for the earth, then it's going to be fitting or right for our bodies. That's a question everybody alive on this planet needs to ask, Nigel said. There are perhaps 1 or 2 billion people who are so hungry they don't have a choice, he said, but the other 5 billion need to ask that question. What should I put in my body? What is fitting or right? How is the land treated that produced this food? How are the animals treated? How are the workers treated? How much sugar is in this? What is this doing chemically to my body and to my children's bodies? Is this fit for me to eat? For Jews, keeping kosher falls under the larger idea of tikkun olam, repair of the world. There's a place in Jewish tradition, Nigel said, where perfecting the world is not about the world to come. It's not about heaven and hell. It's about how can we incrementally make the world a better place now? And one of the ways that these adamanics, as they're called, are making the world a better place is practicing that kind of eco-friendly agriculture, milking goats and growing food without chemicals. And one of the things that I discovered when I was there, they do a weekly farmers market, and they sell the chev cheese that they make from the goat's milk. They sell kimchi and sauerkraut and pickles and other fermented goods. But they also, I was asking these folks as they were milking the goat, I said, well, what do you do on Shabbat? Right? Because you can't just not milk the goat or the goat will get mastitis, right? But isn't that doing work? And they said, well, we still milk the goats, but we take the chev cheese that we make and we donate it to the local food pantry. So it's like the Shabbat milk and cheese from that day is all donated. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of kind of keeping the spirit of Shabbat. So I'm going to turn soon to questions, but in the last few minutes here, I want to just share how that journey that I took in Soil and Sacrament has continued and how it's expanded. And so this journey of reconnecting with the land and reconnecting with the ways we grow our food and connecting that to our faith. I visited this place in Fort Myers, Florida called ECHO. It's the Educational Concerns for Hunger organization. This is a 50-acre model farm with 6 different tropical ecosystems represented. And if you're going to be an agricultural worker or an aid worker, say for a nonprofit in Madagascar or in Honduras, you can come here and learn agroecological growing techniques and take those and share those with people around the world. And so most places don't have an extension agent where people can get this kind of up-to-date scientific agroecological knowledge. And so this is a way of sharing that knowledge widely. And they have a beautiful model farm there that does that. This is a photo of some gentlemen in Niger in West Africa growing their maize crop with acacia trees, which fix nitrogen. They're standing in front of one of the acacia trees. And so this is a way of growing food ecologically that increases the harvest without using harmful pesticides or chemicals. I got to travel to Cuba as well. This is a worm farm in Cuba using local cow manure to create vermicompost, which, as some of you know, it's incredibly powerful fertilizer. Cuba went through a really difficult period in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and their source of agricultural petrochemicals and everything dried up, and they kind of had to figure out how to go organic overnight, and they did it. And within about 3 years, most of Havana's fruits and vegetables were grown within the city and grown with organic practices. And so they've kind of proved that you can grow food organically and don't have to suffer. So this is what came out of those travels. It's the book I've been describing, and this other one I co-wrote with my buddy Norman Wiersbe, Making Peace with the Land. And I'll just share a few thoughts here about globally. As you know, we're in this time of climate change and of our Earth warming, and all of these things are not just neat ideas to explore, but they're actually very practical needs. And this is my friend Miles Silman here, who's a climate scientist. I always like to show a face when I mention the word climate scientist, because these are not people in behind a screen. These are real people doing real work. And Miles is one of the world's leading climate scientists. He's a tropical ecologist who studies the Amazon basin. And I stole this next slide from Miles. And I think this is a great way to visualize the need for a more agroecological way of growing our food, and a way of also the need for reining in our fossil fuel use and stopping deforestation and all those things that we know we need to do as a society. He shows on the left here a fully functioning ecosystem, the world that we're in. And through these pressures that we're experiencing, through fossil fuel burning and through deforestation, through industrial agriculture, we're making this bottleneck narrow that we're traveling through. But through our management responses, we can pull that bottleneck out. And so by growing food in the ways that I've been describing, we can increase the kinds of ecosystems that we'll have on the far side of this century. And I want to end just with a really hopeful example of that. This is a group of churches in Ethiopia that I got to visit, the church forests of Ethiopia. And these forests, these churches are the last guardians of Ethiopia's old growth forests. And so you can see so much of those old trees have been cut down, but all across the landscape are these little pearls, these little green pearls in a sea of brown. And they are guarding the last old growth trees of Ethiopia. And not only guarding, but they're trying to expand those forests, and they're taking genetic material and working with a forest ecologist named Dr. Alimayehu Wasi, who I visited and interviewed, and taking that genetic material and replanting it. This is some of the oldest genetic material in Ethiopia's forests, these old growth forests. And they're taking that and using that to repopulate and regrow the landscape. And you can see the walls that they've built around these forests, dry stack stone walls, as a way to prevent grazing animals from getting in. But to me, it's another beautiful example of a faith community recognizing the need to protect and to guard, to safeguard this beautiful world that we've been given, and to not only guard it, but to grow it and expand it and make their local places flourish. And these are just a couple girls that I met on the road, and this is a couple of those forests on Lake Tana. These are island monasteries on Lake Tana. So I will end with this question for you all. What does this time ask of us? I think it asks that we expand our spiritual imaginations to include an ecological imagination, to let those two become interfused and interwoven like the mycelial strands of mushrooms that the monks grow. And we don't know what kind of fruit might emerge from that if we do. And I'll end on this quote here. I think this is a way of bringing forth, at least within my own Christian tradition, the idea that this is what I've been talking about is not a new idea. This is St. Isaac of Syria, a monk from the 7th century he lived in what is now Iraq. And he wrote this. He said, an elder was once asked, what is a compassionate heart? He replied, it is a heart on fire for the whole of creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals, for all that exists. And I will stop there and turn to
Thank you.
Ian, Ilene, and Anne.
Yes, thank you so much. What experiences you've had? I know we'll have lots of questions. I want to introduce Anne and Ilene in the context of this beautiful project that we have happening on the Tri-Faith Commons. So we have co-located a church, a mosque, and a synagogue with an interfaith center on 38 acres. For those of you who are new to the Tri-Faith Initiative, it's important that you know this is something that only exists in Omaha, Nebraska. And it's an experiment. And I often say we are building the plane while in flight. However, one of our biggest successes to date has been a result of Temple Israel, which is a Reform congregation and a partner in the Tri-Faith Initiative. Their leaders coming to me as executive director from their social justice committee and saying, we would love to have a community garden. And we think it would be a great opportunity to build relationships with our neighbors at Countryside Community Church and the American Muslim Institute. But it feels like a project that's a little outside the scope of what our staff could facilitate. Do you think that you and your staff could help to amplify this effort? We'll give you, at the board of Temple Israel voted, we will give you the land for 2 years and we will provide water. And since the board has revisited that and extended it for 5 years. And we also went to the neighborhood because some of the land that we wanted to plant the orchard on was held by the neighborhood association, and they graciously said we could plant some trees there for our orchard. And that was 3 years ago. Last year, this garden force, this coming together of community, grew over 1,000 pounds of produce. And I was so impressed with that number. In the middle of COVID, so many things stopped, but this group continued to gather and build trust and relationships, but they grew 1,000 pounds of produce. And I'll let them talk about where those things go. But this year, they have grown 2,400 pounds of produce in year 3. Now, as a person who's moved to a new home, I have always heard that there is a strategy that the first year it sleeps, and the second year it creeps, and the third year it leaps, but this is extraordinary. So thank you to everyone who's on the call who has given their blood, sweat, and tears, their time, and their love and devotion to create our beautiful Tri-Faith garden and orchard. And 2 of the fearless leaders, or at least those who show up all the time, are Ilene and Anne. And so Ilene is a member of Temple Israel, and she is on the Temple Israel board, and she is also a regular at the Tri-Faith Commons garden, and Anne is a member of Countryside Community Church. Both of them didn't pause 1 minute when I said, what do you think about reading this book and having this conversation with us? So thank you for agreeing to do that. I think there's some really beautiful things around threes and numbers that have come together, one in particular around the three sisters. And I'm wondering, Ilene, if you might be able to kind of tell us a little bit about that and any questions related to that you have for Fred.
Sure. Fred, you already kind of touched a little bit about the reason that you picked certain places for the book and which ones were your favorite. And one of my favorites was chapter 2 in your book, where you were in Chiapas, Mexico, and you came across Lino, and he had this little garden in the common area where you were, and he was a very quiet man and didn't really talk to many people. He was actually from a long line of Mennonite farmers, so he was familiar with farming, and he taught you about the three sisters. And we also just this year planted 2 plots of three sisters. We planted corn, actually, that we had sacred corn that we had gotten from the Omaha tribe that used to actually be on this land before it was a golf course. And so we had their corn, and we had an ancient trail of beans that we found that we planted. So we planted the corn and the beans, just like in the book. And we had squash that we planted as well that kind of covered the beds. And we had one more sister, or that we called one more sister. We had sunflowers because we didn't really have a windbreak, and in Nebraska there's a lot of wind. So in order to make sure our corn stalks didn't get blown over, we kind of at the end of our little beds we planted some nice big sunflowers. So that was our three sisters, and we got an amazing harvest. I mean, the year before we had planted squash and we hardly got any, but this year we had so much squash. We're still kind of giving it to some of the charities that we on food banks that we give to regularly. And we just really enjoyed that and learning about that. We had one of the founders of the tribe come and speak to us, actually more than once, and tell us these wonderful stories. And it became like really spiritual to all of us in the garden. I'll let Anne also talk about the three sisters and what impact it had on her, because we all helped in planting the three sisters. And so, Anne, do you want to talk about the three sisters also?
Well, the only thing I would add to the three sisters is that I don't like to kill bugs. I think bugs are necessary. We need insects, but I will tell you this, that I went after those squash bugs with a vengeance. And I do, but part of that is because our first year, the squash bugs really decimated our squash plants. And, we don't want to use pesticides or anything like that. Our produce is organic. So one of the most effective ways I think that we tried was to actually kill the squash bugs. So I think that really helped. I do. I just wanted to add, in addition to the garden gets a lot of press because it's so visible. But we also have an orchard that is kind of down. You can't really, the trees are young, so you can't really see the trees even from the street much. But it is really coming along too, and it's in a difficult spot to work in. So I don't work in the orchard, but they are having a lot of success in growing, I think, raspberries. And we have some wildflowers growing down there. So the garden just gets bigger and better. One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book, Fred, well, two things, more than two. I really liked your discussion about fungus and kind of coupling that, what you talked about in the book about edges. And it's really on the edge of things that you have such an enriched opportunity to really do some wild growing. And I think that's so true with people too. You know, I think I just loved it that the coffee roaster at the one garden you were in Washington was a former meth addict. I mean, that guy was really on the edge. And I would like for you to talk, if you could, about fungus, because it's relationships and being on the edge, working with people on the edge.
Yeah, thanks for that. And those are all great insights. And thanks for sharing about your garden. It sounds like an amazing place. I was actually going to read that little section about the edge. So let me just do that now so everyone knows kind of what we're talking about. There's just a couple of brief paragraphs here. This was when I was studying permaculture at Harvey Harmon's farm in the book. I describe, because I didn't grow up with any knowledge of agriculture, I went and worked on a permaculture farm for 3 months and developed some skills. And permaculture is really the art of studying local ecosystems and then modeling your agriculture built on that ecosystem. And so if you live in the eastern deciduous forest, you might create a forest garden with that kind of architecture. Or if you live on the prairie, you might create more of a prairie-based type farm or garden. And so this is part of that chapter. I described learning from a book called Introduction to Permaculture, written by Bill McKibben. It's kind of a famous book in the organic world. Of all the permaculture advice I learned from Bill McKibben, this was the most important. Seek out the edge. Mm-hmm. An edge is an interface between two mediums, Mollison wrote. It is the surface between the water and the air, the zone around a soil particle to which water bonds. It is the border of the desert. Edge is not so much a place as it is a heightened transfer of energy that happens in the meeting of two distinct entities, field and forest, ocean and estuary, scrub and grassland. These interstitial zones between ecosystems are where the greatest exchanges of life takes place. It is along the tree line, not in the meadow's center, where the hawk waits to capture the field mouse. That life is richer at the edge than on either side was something I knew inherently. I'd always felt more comfortable on the margins. I never liked being in the center of anything, whether it was a cocktail party or a continent. At cozy human gatherings, I was always the one with my back to the wall, watching and listening, and often the first to leave. And though I counted myself a member of the body of Christ, that mystical body comprised of both the living and the dead, I had most times felt myself an outsider among Christians. With missionaries for parents, I'd grown up in the church. My great-great-great-grandfather was a bishop in the Moravian church during the Civil War. And my Moravian ancestors left their home in what is now the Czech Republic in order to seek religious freedom. Yet I've always felt a tad uneasy nestled in the church's bosom, which I suppose is fitting, given that Jesus himself, though he grew up in the temple, did not stay within its secure confines. His was a ministry practice out on the land. His most frequent words and miracles were directed not to those in the middle, but to those who lived on the margins. And in that, Jesus was following a long line of divinely appointed edge dwellers. Abraham, the wanderer. Moses, the speech-challenged leader. Jeremiah, the reluctant prophet who married a prostitute as an act of street theater, and then bought a field outside Jerusalem in the midst of a Babylonian invasion. God's chosen agents were nothing if not marginal oddities. And though I've never felt myself to be God's agent, I took comfort in their fringe-like example. If change is to come, it will come from the margins, wrote Wendell Berry in his book, The Unsettling of America. It was the desert, not the temple, that gave us the prophets. So that was kind of a little reflection there on Harvey's farm, thinking how this ecological edge idea, this idea of the ecotone, where two ecosystems overlap, and that being the greatest exchange of life. It really struck me as a kind of spiritual insight as well that's inherent within Christianity and Judaism and Islam as well. I was, when I came back to Isabella Friedman several years later with my students, I taught for a number of years at Wake Forest University Divinity School. And I ended up creating a course out of my visit to Adamah Farm, out of that chapter that sort of became a divinity school course, really just so I could get back to Adamah. It was all a secret ploy to get me back there. But I took my students and we went for the Feast of Shavuot and spent about a week there at Adamah Farm and had this beautiful kind of Jewish Christian dialogue out in the fields with the young Adamanics and with my students. Some of the Adamanics shechted a chicken, and we had Jamaican jerk chicken soup that night. And anyway, it's a beautiful week that we got to spend together. But when we were there, we got to hear Reb Zalman. He was there. It was, I think, the year before he passed. And he was leading that retreat. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life, was getting to meet him and listen to him. But one of the things he said was that he was talking about, this comes back to the edge idea. He was talking about how faith is like a tree, in that a tree has its wood in the center, which holds it up, but that's dead wood. That's not alive anymore. It's just the thing, the tissues that hold up the tree structure. But the tree itself, the living part of the tree, is out on the edge, right under the bark, the xylem and the phloem, and that's where everything is moving and growing. And he said that's like the life of faith. He said we can't just dispense with tradition, which is the wood. We need that to keep structure. We need that to uphold the living part of the faith, but we also need that living, growing edge. And that's where so much life is taking place, is out there on the edge. So that's my horribly paraphrased version of Reb Zalman's teachings, but it stayed with me ever since. Yeah, so thank you for that.
I think that will stay with all of us. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know you had some questions about metaphor. Can you maybe move to that part of the questioning, Ilene?
When reading the book, Fred, we saw a lot of metaphors in your writing and through almost every one of the chapters. There would be a lot of metaphors or points that you would bring that would actually come around and bring you to more of a religious type of thinking, or thinking that how we should look at these things. And one of the examples that I thought was pretty good in your chapter 5, A New Earth, where Eliza Sanchez is talking to one of his students, and he asks, what do you think is the real problem? And of course, the first thing he says is soil erosion, but he says no, that's not right. So would you like to expound on that a little bit more about soil erosion and really what that means and the metaphor that you look when you think of soil erosion?
Yeah, yeah, thanks for that. I don't have that passage fresh in my mind, but in memory, I think he said something effective. We're not just stopping soil erosion, and he was teaching people how to conserve their soil on these steep mountainsides in Honduras. He said we're also stopping the erosion of people's minds. And I think, he was onto something there in that, and this was kind of a theme that came up throughout the book, is that when you're growing food, when you're practicing this kind of regenerative agriculture, you're not just looking at maximum output of yield per acre. It's also about building your inner life and building who you are as a person and building community with those around you, and nurturing that little farm. And so I think that's but one of many examples that just kind of naturally pop up like a field of wildflowers. They're always sprouting up, those metaphors. And I think it's just a matter of being attuned to them. And I think that's what I was trying to do as a writer with this book, is kind of draw out those metaphors that at least resonated with me about this connection between the life of faith and the life of soil. And Anne was talking about the mycelium, and I think that to me is one of my favorite metaphors. And I was talking about that earlier with the mycelial strands working beneath the soil. And what we've learned from people like blanking out on her name. I have her book. Anyway, she's a forest ecologist in British Columbia who kind of was the main one who discovered that mycelium connects different tree species, and that it Suzanne Simard is her name. Suzanne Simard. And her work is beautifully narrated in the novel called The Overstory by Richard Powers.
Right.
Overstory. I'd highly recommend reading that book. A beautiful novel. I think it won the Pulitzer a few years ago. And Suzanne Simard discovered that, we tend to think of, or we were taught as kids, survival of the fittest, and nature is all about competition and natural selection. And what she was showing is that really nature is cooperating, and especially in a forest, it's this highly symbiotic orchestra taking place where all the different species are interacting and supporting each other. And that happens very concretely when, say, a beech tree that's struggling and is not getting enough sunlight will be fed carbon by a pine tree nearby, right? Because somehow that pine tree knows that it needs the beech tree. And the mycelium is the connectional force that unites those two very different tree species and allows them to share carbon with each other. In a forest situation, when the whole forest thrives, every individual within it thrives. And so it makes sense, that would be the case. But this is kind of hard scientific evidence proving that what we all know to be true, the kind of mutuality and conviviality that we need as humans, is also true in forests and in other ecosystems. So I'm kind of riffing on that idea of the metaphor there that you lifted out. But I think once you start interacting with your local place, those kind of metaphors just start rising up. Yeah, it's really exciting that way.
And so we're talked about the beautiful part of the ecosystem. And I know that you had called out some of the pieces about accumulating power and money in particular around Christianity. And I think you had some questions for Fred about your understanding of the book related to that. Is that correct?
I'm not exactly sure.
Ilene?
But I did want to,
Yeah.
if I might, on page 129,
Mhm.
where you talk about shalom, and that shalom is not just the absence of violence, it's a state of well-being, of living in harmony with one's community and with the land. But you also talked about opting out. These are two different ideas, but don't waste your time fighting the empire. Just do what you feel called to do. And I especially right now, that really resonated with me. Can you talk a little more about that, Fred?
Yeah, well, this was in the context of me describing Jeremiah buying a little field of Anathoth outside of Jerusalem in the midst of the Babylonian invasion. And it seemed to me a kind of example of what we were trying to do at Anathoth Community Garden, which was rather than, marching on Washington or going out and fighting for public policy, which obviously needs to happen. And so don't hear me saying that we should not change public policy. We absolutely do. But in our day-to-day lives, we also need ways of creating the kind of world that we want to see in little microcosms, right? If we wait for every big policy change on our bucket list to happen, and if only that happens, will we be happy and at peace, then we're going to live a very disappointed life, right? But if we are working for the big changes on the micro level as well as the macro level, I think those can infuse each other and cross-pollinate each other.
Mm.
And I think that was, I just discovered that in my own life, that you can only be against what you don't like in the world for so long. Eventually you have to be for something. And I came out of divinity school a militant pacifist. I was a bellicose pacifist. Anybody who thought that war was a good idea, well, I had a few things to tell them. And I realized I became a peace worker. That's what took me to Chiapas. And I described some of that in the book. And I described the kind of humbling that took place there as I realized that, you can't be only against what you don't like. And you have to also, if you're anti-war, you also have to be creating the conditions for peace in your day-to-day life. And so that was a big realization for me in the book. And in that journey was finding a way to address things like global hunger or, the climate crisis, or these big looming problems, or the big divide between right and left in our country, and those kinds of things. Finding little small ways to do that at the level of individuals and at the level of community, and sort of moving at the speed of trust and moving at the speed of conversation. I think that was a lot of what I tried to chronicle in the book.
I'm really very worried about the planet. And we were talking in the garden. We worked in the garden this morning, and I think I was talking with Bonnie and Chris about this, but our species depends on other species. Other species don't depend on us for anything. Bees don't need humans. Rabbits don't need humans. We're the only species really that is really dependent on all other creatures. And somehow we have really gotten that we've forgotten that, or maybe we weren't ever aware of that. But with extinction, with more extinctions of species because of climate change, I'm just really concerned about how we're going to survive as a species. I think the world will survive, but I don't know about humans. What do you think? In 25 words or less.
Wow. I share that concern, and a lot of my thinking and writing in recent years has expanded. A lot of what I wrote about in Soil and Sacrament was about food and agriculture.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of my work in recent years has been trying to think in other frames, like the church forest of Ethiopia kind of frame, in terms of how to do this on a landscape, not just in a backyard, but how to change landscapes and regions, right?
Mhm.
And I don't have any big answers, but I think the same thing applies of working at the micro level on the day-to-day basis, but also thinking on the scale of landscapes and watersheds and how to rejuvenate those places. And there's some really hopeful examples. We just need to practice them more. We need to put them into effect and demand that our leaders put those into effect. And that's where the policy and democracy piece comes in.
Mhm.
And one hopeful example is the Borderlands restoration project down in Patagonia, Arizona, which was started by my friend Gary Paul Nabhan. He's a former MacArthur Genius Grant and is an expert at desert agriculture, desert restoration. And he started an organization hiring local teenagers to do ecosystem restoration. And so
Ah.
repairing eroded drainages and replanting native species, those kinds of things. And they've taken off, and it's really become a big thing, and has given these kids out in a very rural place, a real viable job, real skill set, a community to be part of.
Mm.
And that's not a faith community, but I think those kinds of things are where faith communities can and should be putting their efforts, as you all are doing at Tri-Faith, into real restoration projects that have concrete physical results in the world. And I think for too long, we in the Christian world have had a kind of vague language around creation care, and it's amounted to mostly planting a symbolic tree on Earth Day once a year, right? But it's not nearly enough, and we can't just keep things in the symbolic realm. We need symbols, we need ideas, but also we have a planet in crisis that we need to be tending and caring for and reversing the effects of climate change. And this is, so all of the kinds of ecological or agricultural projects I've been describing, and the garden there behind Ilene, the lovely picture of your garden, that's drawing carbon down as we speak. And so I think that's a really hopeful thing, even if it's on the size of an acre. And I think that this is back to the symbolic nature. We can't underestimate the symbolic power of communities doing those kinds of acts, because it inspires other acts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it grows and spreads. So, yeah, great question.
So I noticed, and I have to mention this because it had a big impact. And actually, I just started the Sabbath, and you talk a lot about the book, the Sabbath, and through one of the chapters you're reading it, and it's written by Abraham Joshua Herschel, and it had kind of an impact on me. And I'm just gonna read real quick this little paragraph where he talks about the higher goal of spiritual living, and that it is not to amass a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments.
Yeah.
In a religious experience, for example, it is not a thing that imposes itself on man, but a spiritual present. What is retained in the soul is the moment of insight, rather than the place where the act came to pass. A moment of insight is a fortune, transporting us beyond the confines of measured time. The sacred moments effaced over a lifetime were small investments against despair, so that when you lost your crops or your topsoil
Yeah.
or a loved one, for we all lose something important to us eventually, then you would have enough beauty stored to keep you buoyant.
Mhm.
And he talks about it takes training through prayer to see this.
Yeah. Mhm.
So, can you talk a little bit more about the impact that Herschel had on you, and reading his book?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned Heschel. He's so Abraham Joshua Heschel. For those of you who haven't read his book, The Sabbath, it's a tiny little book, and it's really like this tone poem. It's like it reads like a poem. It's beautifully written and lyrical. And Ilene read some of that you heard. I think for me, reading Heschel was. I'm a writer, and I love language. I love words. I love thinking in images. And for me, it was just, meeting a soulmate, meeting another, someone who I deeply resonated with. And I love Heschel's work. He, reading The Sabbath when I was at Adama, I think was, it helped me see that keeping Shabbat was not just a kind of moral code. It was I got the spirituality of it, I think, from Heschel. I got the what does this do to me as a person kind of feeling from him. How does this connect to my relationship to God? And he wrote beautifully about how the Sabbath arrives like a queen, and he described the Shekhinah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the feminine presence of God arriving on Shabbat. And just that sense of the holy sort of pervading a day in time, right? Not just words that we say, but an actual presence that comes on the Sabbath. So all of that was kind of coming to me through reading his book, The Sabbath. And I think it helped me experience more what I was experiencing during the Feast of Sukkot that I was there to celebrate. And when we did celebrate Shabbat, it was kind of like, okay, this feels different. This is not just another day. And, when the candles were lit on Friday evening and everyone turned off their cell phones, there was a palpable shift in something changing.
Mhm.
And I hadn't experienced that as a kid growing up in a Christian household. Like, you go to church on Sunday, but it's not, you come home and then you're just back to normal life. Maybe you'll get some work done on Sunday afternoon, or maybe you'll have to go rototill the garden, and like your mom makes you. I'm not bitter about that or anything. Excuse me. No, but I think that sense of the day being different, Heschel really captured that in that book. And I think that's what really drew me to that book.
Well, while you're talking about Sabbath, I loved when you were talking about in Judaism, I think it's called Shemitah,
Shemitah.
and
Yeah,
how
Sabbath.
every seventh year
Yeah.
the field went fallow. And go.
Yeah. So this was what the Ottomanics and Nigel Savage were talking about when I interviewed them. They were telling me about the Shemitah year, the year every 7 years. And this comes from Exodus and Deuteronomy, when when the Israelites would take a year and keep Sabbath for the land.
For the land.
And I think there's historical debate about how much that was practiced or how much was symbolic, but the whole point of it was that the land should rest as well as people. So just as people rest on the Sabbath every 7 days, the land should rest every 7 years. And then every 7 cycles of 7, 49 years, the 50th year would be a year of Jubilee, a kind of super Shemitah, if you will. And when bets were released and so on. And so they were trying to think about how do you put that into practice on a working organic farm? And it was really interesting to hear them working that out. Like, okay, we still have bills to pay. We can't take a whole year off. We still have market to go to. And so a lot of what they're continuing to think through how modern Jewish people in America might practice Shemitah. And what does that mean? And so maybe it means driving less during Shemitah year, or vowing to only shop local, or I don't know, there's all kinds of ways that you can interpret the spirit of that law. But it was really fascinating to hear them in the context of a farm think through what this farming law might mean in a modern context. And they were talking about how that agricultural understanding of the Torah had been lost for so much of modern life. And so I think that was kind of a rediscovery for Nigel and for the Adamah folks there to say, okay, how do we give a Sabbath for the land, but also how do we still eat, right? So it was really fascinating to hear them work that out. And there's, Hazan, if you just go to hazan.org, I believe is their website, they have a whole section on Shemitah. And they have teachings and a workbook and some really beautiful resources that they put together that it's kind of a reflections from Torah and the Talmud and various teachers, coupled with kind of how you put that into practice in modern life. So I highly recommend that.
I'd like to ask you some questions about how this experience has changed or shifted your own religious practice. And in particular, I don't know, I think of as a gardener, every year is so different. If I planted the same seeds, there are so many other factors. So now you have all of these different factors that you're considering that have influenced you in your own faith journey. How has that collective shifted your own religious identity or practice?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wendy. I think one big shift for me has been, in my own faith journey, I've really moved toward more of a contemplative orientation in my faith practice. And by that, I mean more of a focus on practice than belief. And so I grew up with a very head up version of Christianity that was all about belief, right? And about believing these certain doctrines. And it's not to say we don't need beliefs, but I think for me, part of the journey that I went on in Soil and Sacrament was really this discovery of putting our faith in our hands, as Brother Dismas said. And, the book is sort of bookended by two communities who have very long histories doing that. Both the Trappist monks, the 1500-year-old Benedictine tradition, very focused on practice and having a daily schedule. And the Jewish community, also very focused on practice and on doing their faith. And that was really attractive to me, both of those expressions of faith. And in the contemplative Christianity that I have discovered, a lot of it is about practice of silent prayer, practicing silence, practicing stillness, the practice of solitude and withdrawal, which then helps you be more engaged once you are in community, that kind of daily withdrawal. And so what that looks like for me is a daily prayer sit. Outwardly, it looks a lot like Buddhist meditation. I'm sitting on a cushion on a zafu and zabuton, but I'm praying the Jesus prayer, which is, Jesus, have mercy on me. And it's a kind of mantra, if you will, that the early Christian monks prayed. And it's been prayed for, I don't know, almost 2,000 years. So to me, that connection of a practice of something that I'm doing rather than a set of beliefs that I give my intellectual assent to has really been transformative. And to me, it's a lifelong journey. And I feel like I'm only just beginning. But that's been a big shift. And I think that, to me, meshes really well with the kind of embodied faith that I was seeking in Soil and Sacrament, of going out and doing things in actual fields and farms and gardens, and putting the faith in your hands. So to me, they kind of feed each other, that inner practice on the cushion and the outer practice of being out in the world and engaging in the kinds of concrete things like growing food or taking food to your neighbors or any of those kinds of things, the acts of service.
That lines up so beautifully with the metaphor that you told us about the tree, and the the hardy center and the edges.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I like to ask really intimate questions, so don't answer any more than you feel willing. But you've mentioned that you came from an evangelical Christian background, and that your parents were missionaries, and you are critical in many ways of the power and the acquisition of money of the Christian church. And so how are these changes, both theologically and in practice, sitting with your family lineage?
Yeah, that's a great question. Boy, you all have some really great, insightful questions here. So I would say with my family lineage,
I really just want to know if your mom's okay.
my parents and I have had some really intense debates over the years. I would not describe them as evangelical, though, in the kind of political sense that word gets used. I would say more they're just followers of Jesus who take it very seriously. But I did grow up in that evangelical milieu. And in a lot of ways, I ran from it. I wanted to get away from it as quickly as I could, because I felt like then, and especially now, that expression of Christianity has so allied itself with power, as you mentioned, with the political right, with political agendas. And to me, there wasn't a whole lot of God left when you start making those kinds of allegiances. And so for me, it was about rediscovering God through contemplative practice, through the Soil and Sacrament journey. And also, I went to divinity school. I have a degree from Duke, a master's in theology. And so studying church history and realizing that this allegiance of Christianity and power goes all the way back to Constantine in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And some Christians celebrate that, but to me, it was an unmitigated disaster, in that it allied what should never be joined together, which is Christianity and earthly power, because we have a long sordid history of pogroms and the Crusades and all of the things that Christians who wield the sword have unleashed upon the earth. And Christians have a lot to repent for because of that. And I think part of that repentance should be giving up power, giving up any attempt to wield the sword and dictate laws for others. And so, I come back to what I mentioned earlier about emerging as a militant pacifist when I left divinity school. And part of that was just reading church history, right? And reading all of the horrible things that have come about from Christians in power. And when you look at Jesus and his early disciples, and you look at the early Christian communities, there were little ethnic minorities living inside this big secular empire, right? And they didn't have power. And I think that's exactly the way Christianity should be, is to be a minority, to not have political power, and to live a faith of service to one's community rather than to try and impose one's beliefs on whichever society you're living in. So that's my little sermon on Christianity and power.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left. I would love to give each of you a minute to just perhaps lift up the one thing about this book, where I can be shameless. Soil Sacrament, I put a link in the chat. We'd love you to go and dig in and read Fred's book. He's invested a lot in these words. So we encourage you to take the time to read the book, to purchase and read the book. And so, Anne, I'm going to turn to you first. What's the one little nugget that you're just going to hold on to?
Well, there's not one. It's the edge idea. I love what you said about the edge. And it, along with that, is the whole idea that it's all about relationships. It's relationships in the plant world. It's relationships in the soil under our feet. It's the relationships that we have at the Tri-Faith Garden with each other. I love those women and guys. There's 2 guys, Charlie and Roger. But, it's all about relationships. And I think that's probably where change really happens.
Thank you. Ilene?
Well, what really stuck with me is, once again, the metaphors and the fact that, we need to cultivate people's intelligence and dig the ditches in their hearts and build the compost piles in their mind. We're dealing with a lot of compost right now. And the fact that for life, what's important for itself is the air and the water, the food, and specifically like the community that we have and build, and that we must care about each other and the people. And like Ann said, we in the garden we all love each other, and it's just a spiritual place for us. And your book that's what I enjoyed most about your book, is just all the different things that I drew from it that had meaning to me as far as a gardener, but also as a religious person.
Thank you. We're going to come to you next, but Anne, there's someone in the crowd who wants to make sure that you have a chance to say what you want to say if you haven't said it. Did you unmute yourself because you wanted to share something before we end? Ann Pickle?
Oh, Ann Pickle.
You're muted.
I didn't want to share anything. I have a question.
Okay.
Fred, before you got involved in all this garden situation, and I think this has been probably one of the most interesting Zoom things I've been on, or even lectures for years. But were you a practicing minister or a college professor? What was your main thing then, back in your other life?
Well, Fred, we'll let you weave that into your But prior to being author of this book, give us a little bit of information and then close us out with the thing you hope we hold on to.
Okay. Prior to this book, I was a writing tutor at Duke Divinity School after I graduated, and I went to Chiapas, Mexico to work as a peace worker, which I describe in the book. I came back, met my wife. She ended up going to Divinity School at Duke, and I worked there as a writing tutor, reading way too many papers on Calvin and Augustine, old dead white dudes. And so I did that for a couple of years, and have always, the kind of agriculture journeys that I describe in the book are kind of one piece of my life, but I've always been a writer, and I love teaching writing. And actually, Lillian, who's here with us, was part of our writing group that I led for the Glen workshop this past summer. And I teach there. It's a yearly workshop, kind of a faith in the arts community, and they're meeting in Asheville in July. If any of you want to join us, it's a week-long spiritual writing workshop, and you can sign up for that. But so before this book, I was teaching writing and also developing the skills of growing food on my own before I started the community garden. I spent a good couple years just learning how to grow food. And then after Anatoth Community Garden, I worked for 9 years directing the food health and ecological well-being program at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. It's a big, long mouthful there, but basically teaching a lot of what I've been talking about in this book to future ministers. So I'm not a minister. I have a theology degree, so I know just enough to be dangerous. But no, I'm more of a writer and a practitioner, I would say. In terms of what to leave you all with, I think that question with which I ended the talk is how can we take our spiritual imaginations and our spiritual traditions that we're each a part of and expand those, not give them up, but expand them, expand the circle of our concern to include our local ecosystems and to have a kind of contemplative ecology at work in our lives, so that our local ecosystems and the creatures that we share our life with, the non-human creatures or more than human creatures, can also have a home with us. And I think we'll be rejuvenated as we engage in that kind of imaginative exercise. We'll be rejuvenated physically and spiritually, and our communities, I think, will be rejuvenated. And I think your community, the Tri-Faith community, will become and is one of those places that people are drawn to. And I think we need more of those kind of little arcs of care and nourishment that people can turn to for solace and for knowledge. So you all are doing that work already. So keep going.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Ilene and Anne, for your time and passion, for everyone who joined us. May we continue to go from strength to strength. Have a beautiful evening.
Thank you,
Thank you
Fred.
all. Thank you. It's a lovely conversation. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you all.
Thank you. Keep writing.
I will.